Operating systems. In this nugget, we talk about operating systems, and we'll start off by talking about a couple of operating systems we haven't addressed in the A+ exam objectives yet. And the first one there would be a Macintosh, or shortened now, it's just called a Mac. Now these two operating systems, Macintosh and Linux, are only mentioned one time on the A+ exam objectives, and I don't think you're going to see an awful lot of them, but we do want to identify them at least so that we can get an idea for some context in relation to what else is out there. These are growing operating systems. Linux especially is starting to compete more strongly against Microsoft in the server market. Then we also talk about Windows 9X. This was the earliest version of Windows that had, the start menu and some other graphical user interfaces that we are accustomed to right now. But the early versions were nowhere near as good as what we see now. Nevertheless, for the sake of context, once again, we need to identify that, and then we'll see the upgrade paths for the different versions of Windows and what you can or cannot upgrade to Windows 2000 or Windows XP. We'll also take a look at the minimum requirements for the hardware requirements for the current operating systems as well. Well, if you've been paying attention to my videos, and I'm sure you have been with rapt attention, then you'll notice that I've mostly been using Windows XP. In fact, I've been using Windows XP Professional Edition, and that's all I've been using. You can kind of see the telltale signs, the quick launch area, the notification area down here, the start menu, and we see, kind of a telltale signs of Windows XP all over the place, although I don't have the verdant green meadow that you normally see for XP, and that's only because since we don't have to record the details of that when I make these recordings, it makes the file sizes smaller and makes it easier to stream across the internet. That's the only reason why. Otherwise, you notice that we are using XP. Now, we also do have to know about some other operating systems for the A+ exam objectives. And it's really not because we need to know a lot of the details about it or even be experts on those other operating systems. As much as anything, it's only to know for sake of comparison what these other operating systems are. One of those, of course, is the venerable Macintosh, which, just in my humble opinion, is an outstanding operating system. It has kind of a little bit more of a niche market. Probably should have been more successful than it has been over the years. It's just, I don't know, I guess it's just that Microsoft Intel juggernaut is pretty much a steamroller of marketing, and they just haven't made the same headway, but they make an excellent operating system, and they have some very specific hardware requirements for the Macintosh OS. Now, when it comes to that hardware, typically and historically, they've been running on the PowerPC processors. And Motorola has typically or historically made these PowerPC processors, which were good for their time, but Apple decided that they weren't making them fast enough and making cutting-edge technology quickly enough, so they decided to abandon using Motorola with the PowerPC, and for future versions of Macintosh are switching over here recently to Intel processors. Now this was a real paradigm shift for most Macintosh aficionados, because that's kind of like making a compromise or surrendering to the enemy, because I think Macintosh typically considers Microsoft to be the enemy with their Windows operating systems, but Windows always has run on Intel-compatible processors. So this is really a switch for them, and I'm not sure a lot of them like it, but I think it's going to work out pretty well in the long run. Also, when it comes to Macintosh, it's a lot different than a PC, because a lot of us, especially that are pretty enthusiastic about hardware and PCs, we go out, we buy our own parts, our own hard drives, our cases, our motherboards, our memory, all of this, and we assemble it all ourselves, and we're kind of proud of the work we do, and then we install Windows on it. Well, with Macintosh, you don't usually do that. You don't go out to the electronics or the computer supply store and just piece together your own system. Usually you buy Macintosh branded systems, so they're not going to be kind of generic or gray box types of systems. No, instead they're going to be the Macintosh white laptop with the trademark glowing apple on top of the cover, or one of their own standalone systems, their desktop systems. So Macintosh is not going to be as flexible with this in terms of how you can put the operating system on given hardware. It's a lot more tied to their specific configuration of hardware. Now, the current versions of Macintosh's operating system are going to be OS X, some flavor of OS X, and it's a Unix-based operating system. Unix-based operating systems are kind of old. They've been around for a long time, like since the 70s, developed by some programmers over at Bell Labs. But the thing with Unix-based operating systems is they have a characteristic of using something called RISC, R-I-S-C, Reduced Instruction Set computing. And that's just the way that instructions are pieced together. And this compares to things like Intel-based processors and operating systems that run on Intel equipment, known as complex instruction set computing. And this is just two different ways of doing that. Now, reduced sounds more efficient than complex, but there's a lot more to it than just that. This is just, I'm showing you that there's a difference in the architecture, and so they have entirely different kinds of platforms that they will normally run on. Nowadays, however, Unix is not strictly tied to some of these RISC types of processors. Now you can run Unix-based operating systems on Intel processors. That's one reason why Macintosh has recently gone over to Intel. But that's probably more architecture than we need to know. But one thing that is very unique about the Macintosh OS is that it's always been known to be extremely intuitive and very beautiful. Very easy on the eyes, easy to work with, and most of the time, just even anybody that's not familiar with computers can be able to sit down at a Macintosh and within a few minutes find something productive to do. Okay, well, maybe they'll find a game to play. But they'll at least do something quite easily with the operating system. And that was where Macintosh really made their bread and butter early on in their history, when Windows was still struggling with DOS and DOS applications and things that were much more complicated to use. Now, the Mac OS has the new Mac OS OS X, Tiger is what they're calling it. And I'm just showing you a screenshot of it here directly from their webpage. You can explore this further if you like. And you notice how colorful it is and how you have multiple windows open and available. That's another thing that made the OS for Macintosh an early standout, whereas Windows didn't really have that, or they kind of simulated that or tried to have it. They didn't do anything nearly as elegantly as Macintosh initially. And even now with Vista out, I think most people would probably agree that if you take a good objective look at the interface and the intuitive operating systems, then Macintosh is still going to stand out. As a rule, Macintosh operating systems are also considered to be less exploited. This relates to security. An exploit simply means that someone's found a weakness or a flaw in the operating system, and then they are able to leverage it to do something that they want to do, which goes beyond what the operating system would normally allow on its own. And typically with exploits, this means doing something like creating a virus that can take advantage of it, or some kind of a worm, or some other malicious programming or script that would then perhaps, for example, take control of a user's computer. Now, this does not mean that Macintosh operating systems are more secure. It's just that Microsoft Windows operating systems are a bigger target, and so hackers have a tendency to focus on them more. And as a result, Macintosh security weaknesses don't usually hit the news with the same splash as Microsoft vulnerabilities. Now, Linux is an operating system that you may have heard of many times in the past. This is really something that's an emerging operating system and is gaining wide popularity in a lot of places. It used to kind of start off as just the computer enthusiasts operating system, or the uber geeks operating system, because it kind of has an independent mindset. A lot of times geeks are pretty well independently minded and don't usually like to go along with the establishment. Well, Linux kind of bucked against the Microsoft system, and it was started by some guy called Linus Torvalds. This is a guy that decided to create an operating system that as an alternative to Microsoft's operating systems at the time, and he wanted it to be small and efficient, and that's exactly what he did. And in fact, the first version of Linux fit on a floppy disk. And so it was pretty cool, pretty good way to go, get a small, efficient operating system that would still perform all the major functions that it really needed to. Now, it's no longer going to fit on a floppy disk for most implementations of it, because it's been modified and grown and added certain features to it, and now there's graphical user interfaces that can go along with it as well. So it's gotten to be quite a lot larger, so that it's not all that small anymore, but it's still a really an excellent operating system, extremely stable as well. And there's no distinct ownership with this. Even though this guy here invented Linux, he didn't really own it. This is a kind of a programming that's called open source, which means that, yeah, he wrote it, and then he publicly made it available on the internet. Someone else can download it and make their own modifications to it and say, well, hey, this is pretty good, but I think I can make the printing better. Or I think I can add an interface to this. Or I think I can, create a game for this, or whatever. So they add different things to it. And it's supposed to be free, more or less, but it's not really technically free because most of the places where you get Linux is going to be somewhere you can't download it for free, but if you want any support with it, you have to pay for a support program, such as with Red Hat. If you go to redhat.com, for example, you should be able to get Red Hat, but if you want any kind of support, and that includes security updates and patches and all the other kinds of things that you would want to keep an operating system current, well, then you're going to have to go ahead and pay for a subscription. And Red Hat, by the way, is just one of the many flavors of Linux. We have Mandrake Linux, we have Debian Linux, of course, Red Hat. So those are some of the major ones that are out there. A lot of different flavors or versions of Linux coming from a number of different vendors. The core of it's pretty similar, pretty close to the same. It's all based on the core Linux kernel. However, they all take their own spin on it, and they all have, of course, their own systems. Linux is based on Unix, and that's where the name comes from. Linus Torvalds, Linus, and then Unix kind of merged together there. And then it's available as either a command line operating system, and if you're really the uber geek for Linux, then you should be able to do everything from the command line. I can do a lot from the command line, but I'm getting too lazy to do it all from the command line anymore, so I pretty much use a GUI anymore. And here's an example of what the interface might look like. Here I'm running in a virtual machine, and I'm running Red Hat Linux. This is their Fedora version of it. And you can see we have, in a lot of ways, kind of a Windows-looking interface here where we have, not really, it doesn't say start on there, but you get the same idea. You can click on start, and then you can choose whatever it is that you want to do. This looks, amazingly like the Paint program, for example. And I'm not trying to put this down. Everything has to have some kind of a graphics editor, some kind of a word processor, some way of looking at things. So a lot of these things, by necessity, have to have an equivalent that would also appear in Windows. However, you get the idea there that there's certainly a lot in common with this interface, just the way there is with Windows operating systems. There's a computer on the desktop, there's a trash can, not a recycle bin, but a trash can, a trainer's home, which is my current logon, very much equivalent to my documents within Windows. So you can see, again, they've taken this text-based operating system and they've kind of dolled it up. It makes it a lot more user-friendly. There are some corporations that do use Red Hat or some version of Linux for the user's desktop. This got a big push out over in Europe a little while back, but as it turns out, a lot of the users did not like it, so I'm not quite sure where that sits right now. They may be going back to Microsoft, but they spend quite a lot of money going to Linux, so kind of between a rock and a hard place there. Now, certainly, if you want to learn more about Linux, you can get that information from a lot of different places. You can get books. There's lots of resources on the internet, a lot of learning places, and so forth. And I'm not trying to sell you a video, but CBT Nuggets does have excellent Linux products that they can also offer to you. Most of them having also to do with some kind of a certification. And then we also see that Linux is available on x86-based processors. In the past, Unix-based operating systems would have to run on CISC-based hardware or CISC-based processors. Now we can run the best of both worlds because we have a Unix type of an operating system on an Intel architecture, and this represents the 32-bit architecture. You can also run Linux on 64-bit processors as well, and this actually works with Intel or AMD because they both follow the same kind of an architecture there. And then Linux is also, much like Macintosh, less exploited. Doesn't mean that it is more secure inherently. That just means that it's a less attractive target. Now, conversely, most hackers like to launch their attacks from Linux operating systems, which is probably due in large part to the fact that it's so customized and that a lot of hackers have a good knowledge of Unix, and so they can do a lot from the command line there. Now, for sake of context, it's best if we do know a little bit about Windows 9X as well. If you're new to operating systems of various types, then this might be something that predates your existing experience. But the earliest versions of Windows, most popular operating systems, started off with Windows 95, and that's where we started with things like the Start menu and so forth here, and the kind of desktop that we have. There was some previous versions of Windows, but they didn't catch on nearly the way that Windows 95 did. And now, in retrospect, compared to current versions of Windows like Windows XP and Windows Vista, this looks really primitive, but back at the time it seemed pretty cool. And then there was also an update to Windows 95 known as Windows 95B, which is what your version would be upgraded to if you added the OEM Service Release 2, OSR 2 is what we used to just call that. And that gave you some additional features, such as gave you the ability to go from FAT, which is what Windows 95 used, to FAT32, which is what Windows 95B was capable of using, and that allows you to have larger hard drives and more efficient file management. And then we had Windows 98, which is really a re-outfitted version of Windows 95, gives you some additional recovery features, some better troubleshooting tools, and very similar to that was Windows Millennium Edition. And it's also known as Windows ME or Windows Me. Looks very much like Windows 98 in a lot of different respects. Some interface differences, some different features, but it was mostly designed for home use, whereas Windows 98 could be used in the corporation as well as in the home. But I've already given you really more than you need to know with the various different versions of Windows here. Other thing to know about Windows 9X is that it's really something called Microsoft Disk Operating System, or MS-DOS based. Underneath the pretty skin and the start menu and the windows and all of that, the operating system really at the core is a kind of a primitive operating system known as MS-DOS. This is how Microsoft pretty much got its start. I won't go through the history of that, but it's a very basic operating system. By adding a graphical user interface on top of it, they really just complicated that operating system. It was kind of a necessary evil because people like to have things that look cool and neat and that are more intuitive as well. So it was something that had to be done. Another thing that was an advantage with this, though, even though it was kind of primitive with the earlier versions of Windows, was it was the first operating system, that is Windows 95, was the first operating system with plug and play. Prior to that, device management was a huge hassle. Even experienced technicians would many times when they were installing, let's say, a modem, have real conflicts with interrupt requests and two or more devices trying to use the same set of resources. For example, a serial port mouse conflicting with a serial modem. That was a common conflict that would come up. Real hassle. Well, plug and play supposedly would help to alleviate that and eventually override that kind of an issue. The problem was it didn't always work as planned, and that's why we jokingly called it plug and pray instead of plug and play. Well, plug and play has evolved tremendously since the early days of Windows 9X, and to the point that with current versions of Windows XP and Windows Vista, man, I haven't had a resource conflict for years. I can't even remember the last time I had one. So plug and play right now is in a pretty mature state, and it works extremely well, especially with the proliferation of USB devices that we have now as well. Also, it's a comparatively poor operating system. Now, that's not intended to be a slam against Microsoft. In 1995, when this came out, it was really cool. It was a good operating system. I'm just saying, compared to what we have now, we look back on that and we say, man, that was a disaster. And the reason why I bring that up, as really it's a matter of opinion, but the reason I bring it up is because you'll still be bringing some customers in, have some customers come in that are running some version of Windows 9X here. And it would probably be to their benefit if you would try to talk them into spending $100, $125, $150 upgrading to some other current operating system, Windows XP or maybe Windows Vista. And the reason for that is because, number one, the features are just going to be better. They work better. They're still very intuitive. As long as they can use the start menu, they can usually find whatever they need to find. A bigger issue, however, is the stability of the later on operating systems like XP and even Windows 2000. The stability of the kernel is much better than Windows 9X. These operating systems here, man, it'd be unusual if you could let those run for several days at a time without having to reboot them because of some kind of a crash or unresponsive program or something like that. Current versions of Windows, I've got servers up right now that are running on the same kind of kernel as current operating systems, like Windows Server 2003. Man, it's been running for months. I've not had to reboot that operating system. With the exception of some service packs, or rather security fixes that require a reboot. But I've never had to reboot it because it failed to perform. And the same kernel that is in Windows Server 2003 is also in all the current versions. Windows XP, for example, and Windows 2000. They all use a lot of the same things, and that's what gives them their stability. And there's also security. We've talked about this in the past, but remember, these versions of the operating systems up here can only run FAT or FAT32, which has no file system security whatsoever. Well, with NTFS on any other current kind of operating system, like the more current ones, well, you can lock down by file permissions specific files, specific folders. You can even encrypt documents. And we've seen a little bit about how to lock down the permissions in previous nuggets. Also, those old Windows 9X operating systems, remember, they're DOS-based, and they don't really have any kind of a lock against them. The DOS base is pretty much whoever's accessing that computer is granted access to whatever they jolly well please. So that someone could perform malicious actions and so forth. Well, now with current operating systems, you have to have a level of privilege. You have to be a member of an administrators group, for example, or a power users group, or some other privileged account that will allow you to do additional functions beyond just normal daily functions like typing a Word document or something. And that's just the start of it. It's just a hardened, current operating systems are what we know as hardened operating systems, which are much more secure and have a lot more shields of defense than this older operating system of Windows 9X. Now then, just for sake of context, I'm going to go ahead and show you a little bit about each one of these operating systems. Here again, I'm using virtual machines for each of these. And here I've gone to Windows 95, where I just have a really old installation of 95. Now, okay, I see that I'm supposed to enter in a username and a password here. Well, it's been a while since I've been in here, and quite frankly, I can't remember what the password was. So I'll just cancel this. How about that? Now, there's security for you, where you don't have to enter in a username and a password, and you still get access to the entire desktop. You know what I could do from here if I had a malicious intention? I could double-click my computer, double-click my way through the hard drive, and just start deleting files that are necessary for the booting of the operating system, for example. I could just do whatever I want. So, it's pretty much very weak in terms of any semblance of security at all when it comes to Windows 95. But at least once again, it was the starting place. It's the one that gave us this kind of a desktop with the icons on the desktop and my computer and so forth, the start menu. At least it got us started. But then we went on to, later on, Windows 98. And guess what? We've come a long ways. We now have a bigger desktop. No, that's just because of my resolution there. But Windows 98 did give us additional features, specifically if you would look into certain kinds of locations such as, let's see, on programs, accessories, and system tools. We had a few extra things here. We had a disk cleanup item, we had a disk defragmenter now, there's a drive converter, so there's a few additional administrative tools there, and then there's additional administrative tools and troubleshooting tools that are not available there. They're available in other places though. Let's see if I go, for example, to start run and type the word command, then I can run another tool, and with this I could run some tools such as, let's see, change directory to system. The system directory there has a utility there called msconfig, and it just allows you to identify how you want the system to start up the next time you reboot it, which components of these various files you want to be able to run. If there's anything in the startup group, for example, there might be some program that you think is causing you a problem, and you can say, I'm going to deselect that and reboot the computer and see if the problem comes back, and then if it doesn't, then you've narrowed down that it was the source of the problem all along. So these are the kinds of things you could do with something like msconfig. First came out with Windows 98, and we have other methods as well now that we can use across other operating systems. And then here we have Windows 2000. Again, it looks pretty much the same except for the color of the background, but you can always change that stuff. But in terms of the intuitive interface, very largely the same as any of the other operating systems I've shown you there, Windows 95 and 98. The difference really here is something you can't see, and that is the fact that it's based on the NT kernel. Because we had other versions of Windows that predated this one, known as Windows NT. There was NT version 3.51 and NT version 4.0. 4.0 workstation and 4.0 server. That was pretty much the first version from Microsoft that offered the security and the stability that we really wanted to have. And it did see its way in a lot of corporations, but it's kind of old for the current A+ exam objectives. Nevertheless, this is the ancestor. This is the child of the NT-based operating systems, so it inherits a lot of this, the system stability and security that we had with NT. By the way, here's a little trivia for you. Do you know what Windows NT stands for? What does the NT stand for? Okay, we'll cue the Jeopardy music and play it for a minute. Da, 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 da. Okay, if you said NT stands for new technology, guess what? You're wrong. That's what a lot of people say. It's never been correct, technically. What it really stands for is, it's kind of a code name for an Intel architecture processor. Back in the older days, years and years ago, Intel had a processor called the NT, and Windows was basing an operating system around the NT processor. That's the code name they used back then. Now we have, much cooler code names than they had back in those days. And then Windows XP, which is what we've been using all along, that also is based on the NT architecture. It's not until Windows Vista, which is outside of the scope for A+ exam objectives, that Microsoft went back to the drawing board and built pretty much everything from scratch and built everything brand new instead of basing it on something from a previous operating system. Now, I've made available for you up on nuggetlab.com a document called upgradeos.doc, and this is just what you need to know. It's not just upgrades, it also is minimum system requirements. But here are the upgrade paths. If you currently have Windows 95, can you upgrade to Windows 2000? Yes. How about XP? No. Okay, so this just tells you what operating systems you can get to. It connects the dots for you. Can you get from A to B to C, in other words. If you have Windows 98, for example, again, you can upgrade to both of those operating systems. ME, which was designed primarily for the home, it does not allow you an upgrade to Windows XP. Okay, just kind of a quirky thing with Windows ME. And of course, NT4, you can also upgrade both. And then here we have the minimum system requirements in terms of the hardware required. Now, of course, even these minimum requirements right here in this middle column, if you tried to run Windows 2000 Professional on these minimum requirements, it would be very ugly and slow. Just an awful lot like my sister when she was in the 6th grade. Ooh, she would never like me if she heard that I said that. So anyway, what we have here is we want to make sure that we get out of the minimums, and this is something you'll just have to recommend to your customers. Rarely, if ever, will someone bring into you a computer with this kind of hardware in it anymore. You know, it still does happen, but hopefully not. The recommended requirements from Microsoft you can see appear over here on the right, but even these are just really bare bones minimum, in my opinion, especially if you have new computers that you're installing Windows 2000 Professional on, like a bare bones system. The processor is going to be probably at least a Pentium 4. It's going to probably have at least a gigabyte of RAM, and it's going to have probably 60 gigabytes of storage, and a hot new video card, because the prices come down on all of those things so much. But that gives you an idea, at least in terms of what the requirements are. Same thing with Windows XP Professional down here. Again, recommended is better, but current hardware will make this run much, much better, even than the recommended minimums. And that's what these are, by the way. When it says recommended, that really means recommended minimums to get the operating system up and running, which is just much better than the bare minimum requirements over to the left. In this nugget, we took a look at various operating systems, where we started off by looking at the Macintosh, which uses the OS X operating system. Remember, it's very easy on the eyes, very intuitive, and it's a really nice operating system. And we also saw the Linux operating system, which started off just on a floppy disk, but now has grown to include a graphical user interface in addition to the command line. It's also a Unix-based operating system like the Mac, and it's giving a lot of competition right now to the Microsoft Windows Server products, because we're seeing this more in servers probably than we are on desktops for just the average user. Then we also took a look at the older versions of Windows, Windows 9X, 95, 98, and so forth, and we took a look at how we can get rid of them, because after all, they're not that good compared to what we can currently get with an upgrade path to Windows 2000 or Windows XP. And then we took a look at what the minimum requirements would be in order to use 2000 or XP. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.